Brilliant. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to our webinar, which is titled Stop Flying Blind in a World of Nature-Related Risk. I'm Karen Hitchke, I'm the CEO of Building Bridges, and I'm really delighted to welcome you here today. As you probably know, at Building Bridges, we are very much focused on moving from dialogue to action and implementation, and from capital investments to impact. And investing in nature is really not longer a frontier issue. It's really becoming essential now to how finance measures risk and opportunity. And that was already quite clear last year at our conference. And you'll be excited to hear that at this year's conference, we have 18 nature finance sessions which are going to be featured. So you have basically quite a range of events to pick from. And you can already mark the date, of course, the 30th of September to 2nd of October. Registration is open on our website, so we hope you'll be able to welcome us. Just a few housekeeping things before you leave. We'd love your feedback today via a short survey that will pop up once the webinar is closed. And that will really help us, gauge what is your interest, be better in our conversations here and deliver better impact. So please keep building those bridges, give us your feedback so we can learn from that. Now, coming to today's conversation is particularly timely. We see really that shift from where nature risk is becoming a financial risk. And we have the right experts here today on the panel to talk about that. And just to mention one example, just a few months ago, you've probably heard about that, but the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund published that they consider more than 90% of the portfolio at risk of nature exposure. And I think that already demonstrates how important that topic is really becoming. So today we will start with a keynote message from the expert perspective. David Craig, thank you so much for joining. He's a co-chair of the Taskforce on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TNFD, as you probably know it. And his leadership has really helped shaping the global financial system to understand better the role of nature in economic resilience. And we are very proud to have been hosting the launch of the TNFD in Europe in 2023. And then following David, we will have Teresa Hartmann, an expert in natural capital, carbon accounting, and sustainability, to moderate this exceptional panel today. Thank you so much for agreeing to join us here. And then I'll let Teresa, without going too much into detail now, introduce the speakers after that. If you have, we would really love to see you in the chat. So please introduce the participants. Please introduce yourselves in the chat, where you're joining us from. We're always interested to see that. And then please also post your questions in the chat. Teresa will take those questions during the session and play them back to the panel. So please make this an interactive session and participate actively. So with all of that, a very, very warm welcome. Thank you to our panelists, to our keynote speakers, to our moderators, and to all of you who are joining us here today. And I hope we have a really interesting hour in front of us. Thank you very much. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Karen. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. I think it's afternoon, not morning for most of you. And thank you for the invitation to talk to Building Bridges event and the invitation to speak today. Very much looking forward to the event later in the year. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we really start to address nature risk in our financial system. Our financial and business world sometimes seems a little bit more fragmented, and the world that we live in is becoming more disconnected, whilst of course the natural system is a highly connected system with a finite set of resources that we all share as a common good. So how we work together, how we align our approaches is good for our businesses, our economies and societies that depend on a healthy global natural system. And that responsibility is really in our hands. There's been so much said about the material impact of nature on business and economies. I don't need to repeat the figures that are there. I think the evidence is overwhelming now. And the question is not if there is risk, but how is that risk manifesting itself and how do we address it? Our economic and financial system is embedded in nature. Nature degradation is reaching unprecedented levels due to our resource use, our pollutants, our consumption, but also climate change. And the repercussions from nature degradation cascade through a range of channels to our businesses. So that evidence is really clear. And this can translate to financially material outcomes. And so we should really start moving to a case where we start to assess those risks and opportunities, we start to mitigate them, and we start to take action. And the good news is there are lots of financial tools, methods, and frameworks that are now being developed or have been developed that can help you do that. That includes, of course, the TNFD, now being deployed in many markets with the tools and recommendations that have been developed by our task force and the industry. There are now financial lenders, asset managers, and owners representing around 20 trillion of assets committed to TNFD-aligned nature assessment, nature-related strategy and risk management, and of course, more disclosures, more transparencies and reporting. Of our well over now 500 adopters that keeps growing every week, we now cover over 55 jurisdictions. We have a quarter of the GSIBs, the global significant financial institutions, including, for example, UBS as adopters. And we have 10 other Swiss organizations adopting the TNFD recommendations. A relatively small number, but Europe, of course, is much larger in terms of our adopters. Around a quarter of our adopters are from the EU as well. So we have a broad base of companies and financial institutions now adopting the TNFD. And really importantly is we're starting to see the first reports appear in the public market. You can go and look at them and find them and see what's been written, see what companies and financial institutions are discovering as they assess their risks. There are also AI and technology tools out there that can also go and look at them and tell you what some of the risks are. So we're living in this world where technology and data is enabling us to have better understanding. So it's fantastic in just 4 years to move from the design work of TNFD to actually see full disclosures representing the assessments that companies are making. And what do we think is going to happen in the next few years? We hope, we aspire that we see their actions and the inputs and the assessments that these companies and financial institutions are making change how they invest, change how they lend, change how they interface with the assets that they own and the clients that they have. We are starting to see this today as companies take a more integrated view of nature and climate as an integrated issue. We built upon the recommendations of the TCFD. That was incredibly helpful because many companies and institutions are very familiar with the 11 recommendations and the framework of the TCFD. But we, of course, had to add in the nature context from climate to incorporate nature into TNFD, including location assessment and analysis. And of course, everyone who's involved in this field knows that nature is highly contextualized, highly localized, and you need to assess where you're operating, where your supply chain is, and the natural characteristics of those ecosystems and the ecosystem services that you're using to understand nature risk. And that's what our LEAP toolset, the LEAP approach, which stands for Locate, Evaluate, Assess, and Prepare, does. It supports financial institutions and companies to identify where they're located, what are the ecosystem services and dependencies that they have, the impacts that they're making, and how does that translate to risk and opportunities. So that's one of the most powerful tools that we've released into the market. Many, many companies, beyond those that have publicly said they're doing it, are actually using LEAP to make this assessment. We've also released draft transition planning guidance, which provides guidance on how to think through the transitions that you're going to have to make as an investor, a lender, or a company to move away from the things that are harming nature to transitioning towards those things that are doing less harm or mitigating the harm in the first place. On the transformation side, our upcoming TNFD opportunities case study collection provides now real examples of how nature and technology is contributing to nature positive outcomes that can be good for business and nature. We've just recently completed a market sizing in the UK that found over 900 companies founded in the last 6 years, so relatively new, innovating and providing new solutions in new materials, processes, food, packaging, resource management, over 100 activities in over 20 sectors that help mitigate nature loss. And this study found that this opportunity in the market size and opportunity in the UK alone was over $2.5 billion and growing at 25%. We'll carry on looking at other markets as well to determine the size of this opportunity to really invest in the technology and processes that help us mitigate nature. So that's where we are. We are moving to a world where we're much clearer about the risks that we have inherent in the system. We're starting to build many of the tools that we need, not just TNFD, but many of the financial instruments, the transition instruments, and the other things that we need to do. I've been involved in the biodiversity credit work, which is a very interesting tool as well to help transition and help finance transition. We have green bonds, we have funds, we have private equity and other investment as well. So where will this take us over the next few years, and how do we look forward from where we are today to where we'll be tomorrow? And our aspiration is we'll see suppliers through their value chain start to address the nature, start to look at those alternative processes, technologies, and materials that reduce their impacts. Our aspiration is that we see a global financial sustainability standard, adopting TNFD recommendations and metrics. I haven't mentioned much about metrics, but we've boiled this down to 9 indicator groups related to the dependencies and impacts. We hope those are incorporated into standards bodies around the world, and in particular the global baseline, the ISSB, as well as the national standards, so that we have consistent, comparable, and more simplified data and reporting around the world in what is inherently a global connected system of nature. We also see that these tools help us achieve the goals of the Kunming-Montreal GBF being achieved, like, for example, protecting 30% of our land and oceans, reducing pollutants, harmful substances that we rely upon, and also helping improve the data that is available for finance to redirect financial flows, to have a better understanding of what the areas are causing harm, to redirect financial flows to those things that are creating more nature positive outcomes. For those of you who are familiar with the details of our framework, you'll recognize that many of the impact drivers align to the GBF because they're designed around what we know as the at best drivers of harm. What are the 5 areas of harm that cause the most damage to nature? And how do we measure and manage against those drivers of harm to make sure we mitigate the risk and the impacts that we're having? So ultimately, this is a big team effort. We have over 1,800 members in the forum that are helping us develop these tools. We have an active task force that's doing it. We're collaborating with many of the other groups around the world, from science, nature, and finance and business, to try and create a consistent, coherent framework to approach this. My message to everyone on this call is if you haven't started, why not? The evidence is becoming clear, and many times in human history, we've acted too late on evidence that's in front of us. But the other reason is it takes time. It takes time to build awareness in your organizations of what ecosystem services are, where am I located, what are my dependencies, where are my suppliers, how do I unlock some of the data that I need internally to find that out. That takes time, understanding, and knowledge. And then you need the expertise around the natural system as well, and the state of nature information that is essential to understand the context of the impacts and dependencies that you might be having in a local area. So that's the reason for starting now. We often act too late, and we underestimate the amount of time it does take to create knowledge and build understanding. So the ultimate test for us is the ultimate test is our younger generation. It's the people who may be not in this room that say to us in years to come, you knew about this issue, you didn't act upon it, what did you do? And hopefully we can say, well, actually, we did act on it. We created the frameworks and tools, we worked together, we addressed an issue that has been inherent in our business and economies and financial system for many years, that we've underpriced nature. Now we need to correct that. We need to put nature back on the balance sheet and use the tools that we've developed to do it. So with that, I'll hand back over to the speakers, and looking forward to the panel and the conversation that will now start.
Thank you, David. And I think that's such a great moment to hand over, right? It is a team effort. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody who's dialed in, who's joining us today. We are the team. I'm joined here today by a wonderful lineup of speakers. I have Lenka Moore here, who is the finance lead and senior manager at the Capitals Coalition. We have Vian Sharif, who is the president and founder of NatureAlpha. And we have Manjit Jus with us, who is the I'm going to fall over this one, the Sustainability Data Strategy Lead at UBS. I'm going to just start us off with a couple of numbers, and I don't think that you have to remember them because we will keep reminding you of them, right? But like, I think we all understand the challenge, right? As in like human life, all of us, we all depend on nature, right? And I think the heat wave right now is making that really, really clear, unless your air conditioning is working, and that also depends on natural resources. But there are some great numbers floating around. So the World Economic Forum a few years ago said that 44 trillion of our global GDP are highly or moderately dependent on nature and natural assets, right? And really what the colleagues at the WEF would always tell me is like, you know, there's 44 trillion, so about half our global GDP at the time are highly or moderately dependent, but it's really the entire economy that is dependent, right? Because there will be knock-on effects. Couple of other numbers that I think are good to recap for ourselves and recap regularly, right? So UNEP, so the UN Environment Program, estimates that there are 7 trillion in funding that are currently going into environmentally harmful investments, right? So we have a chunk of $7 trillion a year that we actually need to move out of harming the environment. And then on the other hand, we have something like 200 billion a year that are going into nature-based solutions, right? So really into solutions that help us shore up natural resources and ecosystem services. And we need to triple that number. So triple the finance that's currently flowing into MBS to reach global targets, right? And those are global targets on climate, on biodiversity, on land degradation. And there's something like 80 or 90% of the finance that's currently flowing in the right direction is public finance. We all know that government spending is not infinitely scalable. So really what we're wanting to do is crowd in private sector finance, right? So like, how do we help move the economy and private financial flows into the right direction to make sure that we can safeguard our economy, but ultimately safeguard human life on this planet? So I'm really wanting to come to you, Lenka, first, because the Capitals Coalition's done a ton of work on sort of those interdependencies and how the economy relies on nature at its heart. Can you unpack that for us? Like, which sectors are exposed? Where are the interdependencies? What are we looking at in terms of impacts today?
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you for inviting me. 2025 really feels like a pivotal year for nature and climate. We have COP30 in Brazil, where both climate and biodiversity are on the agenda, and the governments are expected to submit their updated climate and biodiversity plans this year. And in addition, there's also an increased understanding of the interconnection between nature loss and climate change. And if you really think about it, climate change, nature loss is the second biggest driver of climate change, and climate change is the third largest driver of nature loss. So those two are really interconnected. We are seeing this recognition both in the reports that are coming out about the impacts of nature loss on the economy, and warnings about the financial crises that are going to happen if we don't really tackle this. But to me, the positive things are happening too. There is a recognition, the NGFS recognized that climate risks are part of nature risks. There is, which is a fundamental kind of broadening of understanding for the financial sector. There are central banks and supervisors that are doing exposure analysis to nature loss. And there's the Dutch central bank, there is Hungarian, there is Malaysian, there's whole sway of central banks across the world that are starting to do this. And what we can expect is seeing some of this understanding and policies that will flow down to the financial sector. But coming back to your question, there are sectors such as agriculture and fishing and food and beverage industries, mining, that are highly dependent on nature. So it's good to focus, once you do your exposure analysis, once you identify your portfolio, once you identify those in your portfolio, it's good to focus on those. But overall, to me, the relevant question isn't who is affected, but actually who is not. Which countries and regions are okay, which food groups are unaffected, and what supply chains are remaining intact. So whilst the 50% of GDP is dependent on nature is useful in conversation with institutions that haven't focused on nature so far, I really struggle to think which companies and the financial institutions that actually provide the capital to them are not exposed to nature risks. Nature risks present systemic risks to the economy and financial stability overall. So whilst talking about the risk, it's useful to illuminate the magnitude of the problem and start preparing for this. At the core of our problem is that in today's economic system, we do not recognize and place nature at the heart of our economy. We don't recognize as the infrastructure that allows for the economy to function, and that our planetary as well as human well-being is directly linked to the well-being of nature. So what we need to do is to shift the narrative and the way we talk about this. Nature, people, and society have traditionally been considered as externalities, which has led to the current problems we're seeing today. So we now need to shift this narrative to place nature at the heart of the economy and recognize and account for the value that nature brings to us. Today, a dead tree is worth more to the economy than a living one. Old growth forests are being cut down to plant new trees to harvest carbon credits. We only recognize the value of one or two ecosystem services of this tree. So there's the provision of wood or carbon sequestration, rather than the multitude of others, which could range from climate regulation, water regulation, habitat for biodiversity, air quality improvement, including the shade provision. If you've been walking on a super hot street recently, you know the difference between a shaded side and non-shaded side. So there's also the well-being and also the spiritual values that we associate with nature. So rather than talking about risk, we should be asking questions such as, what is the value of existing nature and the ecosystems that nature provides, and to create mechanisms and incentives to invest in nature, and how to embed the full value of nature into business and financial decision-making and the economy.
Perfect. So that really is the question for us, right? Like, what do we measure and how do we act on that? And I think you put it perfectly earlier when you said you're struggling to think of anybody who's not going to be affected by this, right? Because the knock-on effects are so great. Manjit, I'd like to turn to you. You sit in a financial institution where presumably you're already sensing, feeling, seeing some of the impacts that both nature loss and climate crisis are having on your portfolio, but also incoming regulation, right? So we've seen a lot of movement, certainly at the EU level with the taxonomy and the disclosure regulation, but also at the Swiss level. Can you talk us through a little bit how that's impacted your risk management approach and what you're looking at today?
Yeah, absolutely. So we started on this journey a few years ago, thinking about how we could look at, not just climate, but also nature from a risk management perspective. We began by using Encore, which is the framework that at a sector level shows risks and dependencies as it relates to nature. So while that doesn't offer maybe the most granular view on an individual company, I think it's important to recognize it is a very valuable starting point to Lenka's point, to understand, there's probably exposure everywhere, but where is it really more material, so that you can, break this into bite-sized pieces and start focusing on the most critical areas. And I think this helped us to we created a nature risk heat map, essentially, that allows us to zoom in on the sectors that we find most problematic, where there might be the highest levels of risk. And that gives us a baseline tool to start using this information alongside the climate information that we use, that arguably is more advanced, where we're really looking at asset level location, embedding physical risks into real estate portfolio modeling. So we're not there yet with nature, but it helps us provide kind of a counterpart, if you will, to that climate risk assessment. To the question on regulation, I think that's quite an interesting one, because especially here in Switzerland, where we have FINMA, who released its circular last year, it shows the importance of not looking at these things as kind of siloed topics, but really emphasizing that these two things, climate and nature, are very much connected. And I think the positioning of nature as actually the overarching topic, and climate being a part of that, both, I think, to Lenka's point, a driver of nature loss, but also kind of very much dependent on nature. I think that is a shift in how we think about it, but I think it also helps to break down some of the siloed approach. And I think it's always a capacity thing. These are very complex topics. They are very difficult things to kind of wrap your head around, just from a understanding of the science, and then trying to apply it internally is also very complicated. And so it's natural, I think, that we started with climate, and we're, to some degree still grappling with some of the topics there. But I think this helps to set kind of the path forward, where this holistic view on the intersection of climate, nature, and ultimately, I guess, people will have to happen to really have a holistic approach to risk management. But then also to Lenka's point, where are there opportunities from a financial institution point of view?
So I'm hearing it's time to start heat mapping now, right? As in, the tools are there, use the Encore and go and figure out where your exposures are, but also go and figure out where your opportunities are. And I think we have a question in the chat that probably dovetails well into that, about how do we make investing into nature more attractive, rather than thinking about it as like a global externality, right, or a free rider problem. And Vian, I was actually going to come to you because you work with clients a lot who are trying to understand their exposure today, right, but also who are trying to understand the exposure in the future. So I think I probably have two questions for you. One is sort of like, where do you see the trends going in terms of financial viability of current portfolios that are exposed to nature? Maybe that brings in a little bit of that question, right, as in, like, how does it become more attractive to move capital into the right side of the equation? And then I'd love to just add on a second for you, which is more around what are the new technologies that are coming out? What are the new data capabilities that are coming out? And how does that help us measure better? And hopefully, ideally, when we measure better, it helps us tackle the problem.
Yes, thank you, Teresa. It's a real pleasure to be around the table with these experts and implementers. And in fact, I always say to people who are starting their journey on nature-related materiality that the two resources they should go to first are Capitals Coalition website, which has a number of training materials and really goes into the definitions beautifully, and then the executive summary of the TNFD, which sets that out so well. Why is this a financially material consideration? And Teresa, I think you'll probably tackle your question in one answer. There are three things I think that it's worth raising here. If we look at the momentum and how nature-related considerations are now starting to become real for financial institutions and investors. And so the first thing really is regulation. Regulation has started to help us understand what we need to measure. Frameworks like the Swiss regulators thinking through what constitutes FINMA and nature-related materiality, still a bit of a journey there. We have SFDR, as we know, in the EU, and we have PAI 7 within that. We have CSRD, all of these acronyms, which are European regulations, but also the Taskforce for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which has helped us understand where we start and what we can start to think about in a holistic way. And if we think about where that was 3 years ago, we've moved on so tremendously far in terms of awareness of what to measure. Then capacity within financial institutions. I don't think we've ever seen a time where adoption has been so great. It is doubling, trebling year on year, the sorts of data that financial institutions are using to incorporate these data points around impacts, dependencies, location-related stats into their investment decision-making. But why is that? Really, it's partly because technology has enabled us to see things and create data in ways that we never could before. And this is where we can look at the next frontier, I think. So first of all, location, location, location. Where the materiality matrices of the past haven't really helped us yet is in location specificity. And we know that nature is location specific. We know that if you have a company where it's operating, its supply chain, its downstream value chain is it depends where these are in relation to nature-related risks. And the sort of satellite imagery that we can now beam in, as well as things like being able to gather location-specific data on 10.5 million companies, and that's just us, right? We can then start to match that to not necessarily real-time, but as close to real-time satellite imagery as we want, combine that with more slow-paced scientific data like the BII or IUCN or EMWCMC data on protected areas, key biodiversity areas. But it's this combination that means we can surface insights that we could never see before geospatially, and then put them into models that enable us not just to understand today's impact, but we can model back to enable us to model the future. And we've started to do that analysis, and we'd be very happy to share the sorts of relationships we've started to see in terms of how material, multidimensional nature-related risks might be on a really boring portfolio, the MSCI All Countries World Index, for example. So investors, as we are today, want to understand that if we give or we invest money today in a company, what is our return going to be in the future, which is why the future is so critical. And how we make those relationships work, how we combine these different nature-related considerations, including location specificity, is something that we could probably not do perhaps before today because of the advance that we have in compute, data sources, and the combination of these elements.
Did you say 10.5 million companies?
I said 10.5 million asset locations. Yes. So I mean, the beauty of AI today is that we can put in place processes to search and gather and validate not just where companies are located, but also if they're located next to other operations that might lead to concentration risks. So if I have a mine and it's located in a specific water basin, okay, if I have a mine that's located in a specific water basin around which there are 20 other mines all drawing on the same water source, that's going to create some concentration risk for me. So yeah, it's interesting. And supply chains are the next frontier too.
And the numbers are huge, right? So you're talking about more than 10 million asset locations. We all know that there's, there's a huge number of potential metrics and indicators out there that we could be using. And there's not necessarily the one size fits all, right? As in like which metrics and indicators should we be using for any given company in any given location. So much data out there, and it's potentially a confusing journey. Vian, how do you tell your clients to get started?
It's such a good question, because you're 100% right. Just because there's a lot of data, it doesn't mean that's useful information. What we need to do is understand that understanding nature-related risks and the materiality of nature-related risks, and what our clients are doing in real time now, is starting to say, we know that there are a combination of aspects we need to think about. We do need to understand impacts. We need to understand dependencies. We need to understand location specificity. We need to understand how companies are being governed. Are they managing their nature-related risks into the future or not? And that's actually a task of scraping company documents, news reports, and so on. Those are the elements that come together to inform an investment strategy or approach. And the most recent work that we've done is around tracking cash flows, revenues into the future, and how these different dimensions of nature actually relate to financial performance. Which is why I say sometimes considering nature-related materiality doesn't have to be about creating new asset classes. Sometimes it's about making it really boring. It's just another facet of risk. How do I think about that as an investor now that I can suddenly see it? Al Gore used to say it's like the light on the electromagnetic spectrum. There are some colors you can't see, and what our technology is enabling us to do with the data now is see things that we couldn't before, and enable our clients to see that in real life geospatial information. So interesting times.
Yeah, make the numbers make sense, right? And bring that to life. Manjit, I'd love to come to you because you've been through this, right? Like you've been through the jungle of data and what is material and what is not. And it sounds like UBS has spent a lot of time and a lot of energy in trying to come up with an approach that works. Would you talk us through your journey a little bit and what you learned there, and maybe some of Eva's questions in the chat can actually flow into that, right? As in like, what can we learn from embedded decision making or disclosure management, performance management?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I was very fortunate to be able to spend a considerable amount of time last year looking at a lot of the emerging data sets that have been developed around, measuring biodiversity footprints, looking at different ways of measuring nature risk. I've been in the ESG sustainability data space a very long time, so looking at methodologies was nothing new to me. But the first thing that occurred to me is, to Vian's point, this is very new information. This is information built around science that is new to a lot of people, science that is evolving, science that is coming together on nature. So that's the first part to wrap your head around. And then the next part is, overlaying this with, satellite imagery, overlaying this with asset level information. That is, these data sets are still in development. They're patchy, they're not perfect. And so going on that journey, not just as someone that understands this information well, or thought they understood this information well, but also bringing kind of everyone else in the organization on this journey, that takes time. And we took a very long time to get where we are today with climate information, and we still have very heated debates around information that we're getting around scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, and the completeness and accuracy and reliability of those models. So I think we're on the right path, and I think we'll get there quicker, but you realize that this is something new to many people. And it isn't simply, turning on a switch and then, using this information one day to the next. Although I think the problem that we're trying to solve, the questions that we're trying to answer are quite obvious. And to Vian's point, I mean, bringing this information to life and, having clickable maps and seeing asset locations of companies, this I think brings a new dimension to the way we look at sustainability information in kind of the real world context that maybe we haven't had so much before. But there is still a substantial amount of modeling and assumptions, behind some of the data sets, and I think that will take a bit more time. So I think I think my recommendation, I guess, is do spend time on this because it takes a bit of unpacking. It takes a bit of internal capacity building. It won't happen overnight, but I think the more we understand how we can bring, I'll call it alternative data, together with our own financial information, with sustainability information, I think the better equipped we are to understand not just nature and biodiversity risks, but all kinds of sustainability topics going forward, because I think that is very much the future of how sustainability information will be built. Yeah, so I mean it's been a fascinating journey, but I think it's just the beginning. But definitely, I guess my take is, the complexity of it may seem a bit scary, but it shouldn't prevent you from kind of taking that first step. And there are ways to kind of break this down into bite-sized pieces.
So Manjit is not scared, and if you are, you can give him a call. Lenka, I'd love to come to you with the last question around this data and management topic before we move on into the opportunity space. But there's been a huge amount of work at the Capitals Coalition, not least through the Natural Capital Coalition and the protocol, to look at metrics and measurements, right? And usually the thing that we measure then determines what we act upon. So I'd love to hear a little bit from you what your key findings were on how we best can go about valuing nature and the services it brings.
Thanks. And I'm gonna touch upon a little bit what Manjit just said. There is an upskilling curve, but there are also lots and lots of resources that are available. But he also mentioned kind of the how do we combine the sustainability data and all these new insight, all this new data and all these new insights, and marry them with financial information. And the reason a lot of companies are using the capitalist approach and valuation is they are finding it useful translation tool kind of between the scientific and sustainability worlds and the business and finance worlds. And a story I heard recently from Rain Bunderberg kind of comes to mind. So Rain was a CFO or former CFO of Forico, which was one of the largest forestry companies. And when she started at Forico, her and the ecologist walked into a forest, sat down and talked about the value of the forest. And the biologist was talking about biodiversity and extent and proximity, adjacency. And she couldn't understand what the scientist is talking about. Whereas when she started talking about balance sheet and profit and loss and income and inventory statements, and the ecologist was thinking, I don't know what you're talking about. So I think we're using the capital's approach and the valuation to translate, to create the link between kind of the science and the financial and business worlds. So creating the common language to be able to talk about this. From what Vian said, there is an incredible amount of tools and methodologies that are popping up. And our network has told us that the biggest challenge is not the lack of data and measurements, but actually that there is a lack of trust and confidence in what the methods are used and the valuations, and whether those valuations are fit for purpose. So we have been thinking about how do we actually build a structure around this? How can we increase this confidence and transparency to increase trust? In the process of publishing a better framework for integrated decision making. A part of that framework is governance for valuation that really looks at, it introduces a common structure to build confidence in valuation. And the structure then supports better understanding of how capitalist information has been generated. So there are transparency requirements, there's confidence criteria, and you can then really communicate the confidence report in value notes. So, and then the other point is, to Vian's point of view, sometimes you have to do the boring stuff. We are looking at kind of the accounting side, and in another initiative that we're working on is, which is called Nature on the Balance Sheet, is about identifying and creating accounting tools that are fit for purpose to recognize the value of nature, both on the public balance sheets and the company's balance sheets.
Good. So I'm hearing a lot around trust building, a lot of that around getting into the data, and then really starting to build tools into your own processes, right? To like get nature and the value of the services that nature delivers onto your balance sheet in the real world. I feel like we've talked a lot about this data piece, and I'm hearing a lot around like, you know, sometimes you need to do the hard groundwork, right? And like, that's just something that needs to happen. I'd love to move us on into the really exciting bit, right? As in like, what are the pieces that we really want to see more financial flows go into? And there was a question higher up in the chat earlier that was kind of like, well, you know, if so much of the economy actually relies on natural capital, right? It relies on timber, fiber, food, soils, energy, all of that. How are we going to solve all of this, right? Like, we're clearly not going to solve it through conservation, because if we just protect all our natural resources, we're not using them anymore. So we want to talk a little bit about the solutions, right? And like, I think a term that's been trending, and it's been trending at least since the Climate Action Summit in 2019, if not longer, is nature-based solutions, right? And like, what do we really mean when we talk about nature-based solutions? Because it's not all protection, right? A lot of this is actually around like regenerative business models, and like, how do we create exploitative, like regenerative exploitative models, right? As in like, how do we use natural resources in a way where they can replenish? So Vian, I'd love to start with you a little bit to hear, you know, what do we mean, but also where do you think that the financially viable solutions are that we should be scaling right now, and how can those create multiple benefits?
Teresa, thank you. I think you've highlighted some of the really exciting opportunities, just as in climate, as we see evolving in nature, not just regenerative projects that require funding and investment, not just the nascent biodiversity credit market, but also businesses that focus specifically on circular business models, the built environment, how we produce some of our foundational materials, whether that's cement or timber and so on and so forth, in regenerative ways. These circular ways of doing business are critical and need funding. So as this awareness of nature-related risks starts to grow, and as investment opportunities and businesses move up the capital scale, then they will be able to receive the sorts of funding that they require to scale and grow as parts of infrastructure. And we're starting to see institutional pension funds make allocations to nature. The other thing I would say, though, is, and our thesis right at the beginning of this journey has always been that mainstreaming nature-related risk considerations into the world's largest businesses. So the $120 trillion worth of investable capital out there that's available to shift. Now, even if we start to shift a tiny bit of that, if we start to shift awareness within these companies of what they could do to manage these nature-related risks better, that could be tremendous as well. So again, going back to the point that we can make it about new business models, and we should, but there's so much we can do within capital markets as they stand, and we haven't even touched on things like nature-related or sovereign bonds that are pegged or tagged to nature-related outcomes.
So much happening in that space. Lenka, Manjit, I'd love for you to jump in. Like, where do you see the opportunities? Like, as we start tracking nature as more of a theme in investment portfolios, how do you think that's going to help us move faster and scale bigger?
Manjit, do you want to go first?
Sure. I can go ahead. I mean, so I agree with everything that Vian said. I mean, we do see there is, this issue that, what is available today isn't very scalable. It is certainly a challenge, but I think, there are ways today already that, from a thematic point of view, from companies providing solutions in terms of circular economy, breaking it down really to things like, water management, topics that have actually been around for a very long time. We do certainly see that there are opportunities to invest in the topic of nature. I think from our perspective as well, the more we can integrate it into a framework, into kind of an investment framework to define sectors and companies from a transition point of view, for example, including nature metrics into the way we think about companies as they're going through transition. I think that will also help shape, kind of the investment universe, if you will, or the kind of the baseline definition that we use to look at where there are areas. We also see through our philanthropy work, we do see blended finance opportunities that obviously require private capital, but in conjunction with public money. So definitely the role of the private markets, but also definitely, but in against the backdrop of commitments on the public side. Yeah, and so I think from our perspective internally, the way we define this internally and the way we kind of move past just thinking about climate transition, but also think about nature, I think that will also expand the way we define opportunities across the various parts of our business.
I think for me, one of the most innovative instruments that we've seen are the natural asset companies called NACs, introduced by the Intrinsic Exchange Group. And those are new types of companies that are established to allow investments directly into nature. So when the asset custodians licensed the right to ecosystem services to NACs, they established the economic model, the economic value of the ecosystem services that nature provides, and they incorporate that value of the nature into the enterprise value of the company. And there are couple of interesting aspects for me. So first of all, NAC has a mandate to preserve and restore nature, which allows the ecosystem services to continue and appreciate. And the second aspect is the social side. So they are designed to provide investment back into the community through equitable benefit sharing. So the communities are not just the beneficiaries of uplift in nature, but also as owners and shareholders of these NACs. So that's a new market-based solution. For me, the far harder solution really is to look at the accounting side. How do we change the accounting rules and start embedding kind of nature into the accountings and balance sheets? And interesting enough, what we are seeing is when companies start to do natural capital balance sheets, and the CFOs are starting to see kind of see nature as on the asset side, nature and the ecosystem service asset side. There is a shift in thinking. All of a sudden, the nature is not considered either as zero value or liability, but actually as an asset, and it allows them to think, well, as a CFO, I am a value protector, so I really want to see the value either preserved or increased. And that kind of gives them the permission to have different types of conversations and really think about how to protect nature, how to protect the value of nature. So I think that is the interesting bit to me. It's the mindset shift, both in terms of how do we embed the value of nature and people into the economy, and how do we kind of accompany that with the mindset shift and the tools that need to happen to make this transition possible.
Yeah, so how do we embed the accounting so it comes straight with us? I see that David is still online and active in the chat to talk a little bit about what it really means to transform industrial value chains and processes through nature-based solutions. David, I don't know if I can surprise call on you and bring you. There we go. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
I was listening to the conversation, which has been really helpful, and I think having the panelists talk about some of the practical things you can do is really helpful. Sometimes we make the mistake of staying at the sort of 60,000 foot. We have to take it down to the bottom. I thought the point that was made, which was investing in nature doesn't mean investing in bees and trees, as I call it. Investing in bees and trees is really important. It's very good. It should grow. But investing in nature can mean investing in water reduction, as was said. It can mean investing in finding alternative to a chemical pollutant to a natural solution. It can be investing in biopackaging and some of the amazing natural materials that we have. It could be not using concrete, but using wood or even bamboo, as many people are in Asia. One example that came across my desk recently was when we recycle electronic waste. So we think about nature harm as all about farming and textiles and others, but think about the technology sector. We create phones, circuit boards. AI revolution means circuit boards last 2 years. We throw them away, and we recycle them at the moment by burning them. We incinerate them, and this is done in the UK. It's done in Europe and other places, and we collect a small percentage of the gold. A group of scientists invented a method using eutectic salts that can dissolve the gold and precious materials away and do it at 60 degrees, not 1,000 degrees, and not release harmful chemicals into the atmosphere. That's an investment in nature, because I can now reclaim precious materials. I don't need to go and mine from them, higher rate. I can avoid poisoning people, literally poisoning people and the natural wildlife amongst us, because we're not burning these chemicals into the atmosphere and doing it. And I've actually made money in the process of doing it. So we need to open our horizons to what investing in nature actually means. Actually, what we need to do is invest in doing less harm. And I'll keep banging on about this, because often the conversation sort of goes into this natural conservation, preservation, really important, but we need to invest in doing less harm. So I'll get off my soapbox now and let the continue.
It's a great soapbox to be on, and I'm going to use that to kick us off with closing statements. So I'd love to hear from each of the panelists what really stuck with them, but I'm going to repeat what David just said on the soapbox, right? So like investing in nature means things like alternative materials, it means alternative fertilizers, it means more efficient ways of production, it means better farming methods. It means all of those things, alternative building materials, alternative textiles, and so on and so forth, right? And like, I think we do need to get away from this idea of conservation and protection and into this idea of like more efficient resource use in a regenerative fashion that helps us achieve the goals that we all have. With that, I'd love to hear in 1 minute from each of the panelists, what was your key takeaway of this discussion? I'm going to start with Lenka, because you're smiling at me and I hope you're ready.
Thank you. I'm not, but I think it's been such a fascinating conversation and so many great points made by the speakers. For me, what really stuck with me is, and we see this echoed when Manjit said just start. There is a learning curve. There is a lot of resources. Doesn't have to be perfect. You know, don't let the perfect be the enemy of progress. And for Vian, I was fascinated to see kind of the tech side and how much progress there has been done. And for me, is we need to start seeing nature as fundamental infrastructure and the core of the economy together with people.
Perfect. Vian, what was your key takeaway?
Fascinating comments from the panel, and David, from you as keynote. This piece around mainstreaming nature into investment thinking and decision making. And then to Lenka's point, given the complexity of this and all the data that is required to do that, how can we make it as easy as possible to access transparent information? That's what we do through agentic models that then power chatbots. You can just type in questions. You can look at online geographic maps that help you see this, help you visualize this. We've got to make it easier and user-friendly so that it can become absolutely second nature, no pun intended, to actually start using this.
Manjit, what's it for you?
Yeah, so I mean, again, just from kind of a practical point of view, you know, I agree with the point that it's not that we don't have enough data. I think it's just building trust in the information that we have, making sure that it's well understood, and that will take time. But I think, you know, it's no better time than to start now. And then I guess I will share an insight from our nature conference, which we had a few weeks ago, which I think some of you attended. And I think that really showed kind of the growing interest, not just in, you know, talking about data or risk, but really also from our clients. So we had, you know, about 200 people attend, and over half of those were clients. And from what I heard, people didn't just stay compared to previous years, you know, for an hour or so and then leave, but people actually ended up staying for most of the day and listening in on a lot of the side panels, which led to, you know, people having to stand in the hallways, and there simply wasn't enough room. And I think that's a positive development, and that was very, you know, a nice takeaway to see that we may not have all the, you know, the products and you know, the markets developed yet, but from a client perspective, this is definitely a topic that is, you know, on their minds and is definitely front and center in the discussion around transition and sustainability more broadly.
So we do have the momentum, we do have the data, we just need to turn it into insights, and then we need to embed those accounting tools into our decision-making processes, right? And like, I think that's really important alongside what David just said, which is shifting the narrative towards more of an industrial process kind of conversation, as in like, how do we shift, how do we create real economic transitions in the real world? With that, I would just like to say a really big thank you to everybody who joined. I'm really glad to see so many familiar faces in the participants, but I'm even gladder to see new faces. I always think it's great to see the growing movement. And like I think David said in the beginning, it's teamwork, right? So we are the team, this is the team. Go and do your bit on this really important topic. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to David for updating us on the TNFD. And of course, a huge thank you to Building Bridges, who've set this whole thing up and got us all here and got us all together. One last piece is that the Building Bridges Summit is taking place from the 30th of September to the 3rd of October. So if you want to have more good discussions on nature and energy and all things sustainable finance, please do go and show up for that conference, which I believe is in Geneva again, with the whole Building Bridges network. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.